Hey guys, welcome to today's video. Analog versus digital, the age-old question. Can you do analog-ish work in the box, yes or no? If yes, what tools do you want to do? And what does it even mean to mix analog? What is the difference between analog and digital? And why do so many engineers still insist that that is the way to go? This and more in today's video. Let's do it. So before we get started, if you want to work with me, hit me up on my website below. I do mixing, mastering and coaching, one-on-one lessons for you to learn how to mix, how to master, how to produce and what it is to record and all that jazz. I'm happy to help you. You can hit me up for a free 15-minute consultation. Let's see what we can do. Maybe I can help you in some way. So, analog versus digital. What does it mean? Where does it come from? What's the difference? What is the big deal about? Most people consider analog sound when it's kind of warm, when it's not harsh, when it has a rich, full character that is not spoiled by digital artifacts and the side effects of digital conversion. But most people, I would say, associate an analog sound with a warm, organic sound, whatever that means. The other element is, which is more scientific, is the overtone extent, or the extent of the overtones. Analog is inherently better in capturing the full spectrum of sound relative to digital, because digital is inherently limited in its tone spectrum by a dynamic range, which is determined by our recording bitrate, which is still 24 bits. It's not that big. We can still not capture actually the full extent of a classical orchestra with our converters. And then we are also limited in terms of frequency by the spectrum that we can record. Of course, if we record at 44.1 kilohertz, what that means is that the highest frequency we can capture is 22.5, so the half of it, kilohertz. Now that seems like a lot considering that our ears are only sensitive at birth, according to scientists, up to 20 kilohertz, but the thing is that just like our eyes, we cannot see infrasound, we cannot see ultrasound, but it does exist, it is there. Or like a camera, when you change the white balance, just because you've changed the white balance and now your image is warmer or colder, it doesn't mean that the colors are not there. We just don't see them. The sensor doesn't see them and we don't see them. And the same is true for our ears. So just because we cannot physically hear something with our ear holes on our heads, it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect us. And there are many, many scientific studies, and there's a link below to a video I've shot with one of these scientists who has dedicated his life into researching this and then promoting a better way of listening and a better way of understanding and indeed appreciating music. So the reality is that even though our ears might not hear it, if there is frequency content above the 20 kilohertz, if it comes from speakers that can reproduce it, it will of course affect us because we listen with our whole bodies. If you hit yourself on the hand or if you flick yourself in the jaw, that resonance, it will go through your bones into your ears and to the hearing nerve. So there is a translation happening there. There is a recognition happening there. And the extent of the overtones will affect how we perceive the music, especially in its emotional content. Again, it's better if you watch that conversation with this gentleman. It's very interesting what he had to share, but essentially meant that there's a limit at around 80 kilohertz that you can still appreciate that. If you have up to 80 kilohertz of the full bandwidth of a song, then the music will affect you differently. And then it can be limited to what kind of file format we need, and he talks about that in detail. So to me, that is the big part of the analog sound, which is the extent of the overtones, which is virtually unlimited. If you use analog recording mediums like tape, for instance, or even vinyl. And then the whole signal chain, of course, does not restrict this. So once you convert it to digital, the Nyquist filter, which cuts off everything above a certain frequency so that our converters can handle it, will essentially cut off part of the soul of the sound. Now, to me, the second most important difference between analog and digital is the summing. So DAWs are amazing in being very precise and being mathematically correct. But what happens is that when we are summing together, as you can see here on my screen, what is this? 30 odd channels, 27, yeah, 20, 30 channels. or okay, sorry about that, about 106 channels. The digital summing of that will be very different than the analog summing, because in analog we will sum voltage or current together depending on the type of console you're using. And of course that is very, very different. The interplay between the waves will be different than a purely mathematical summing that is based on zeros and ones. And indeed, one of the services that I'm offering now together with my friend Perry is this analog summing. So I take my mixes, I export stems, which is still not ideal, but the best we can do for now. And I send the stems to him to sum it through his Neve console. And then he sends me that summed mix back in 96 kilohertz, because we want that extended overtone content that we are now somewhat regaining because of the use of analog gear. And then we do the master with this 96K print. And the difference is insane. I'll do another video later just on that, but it's fantastic. It sounds amazing and the feedback has been overwhelming. It's very, very amazing. So there are benefits and drawbacks for both ways of working, of course. One of the drawbacks is digital has a lower noise floor, for instance. Does it matter as much? I don't know. Modern, very good quality analog gear doesn't have much of a noise anymore. But if you use vintage equipment, you know, that will generate a lot more noise. Don't know how much of an issue that is. But yes, digital is more clinical, it's more perfect. It will not have that much self-generated noise. And the second most important difference are the nonlinear characteristics of digital versus analog, whereas analog behaves always different depending on how much signal you feed into a particular piece of equipment. You know, you get different kind of distortion, harmonic characteristics, and digital cannot and will never be able to emulate this perfectly. Now, of course, manufacturers of plugins, you know, I have a lot of, I only use analog emulations, more or less. But they make amazing plugins and they model, you know, the different channel strips of different consoles and different pieces of gear. But it is virtually impossible to model every different stage, every different setting, every different, you know, position of the knobs and how it reacts with all kinds of different signals that we have. They usually use sweeps or white noise or impulse responses, but it's not perfect. And often what happens is that they measure two different settings and then they create an algorithm that estimates how this piece of gear would behave in the in-between positions, which is of course less than perfect. But I'm not an expert on this, but I have seen how some of this is being made, and they were using impulse responses of the different positions and then estimating the in-between ones. I'm not telling you which manufacturer that was, but I know there is better ways of modeling, but even that will only be able to model that particular piece of gear, and we of course don't know what cables they use, so the whole signal chain is already spoiled. I'm using very, very, very expensive, very special cables that you can inquire about if you want, also invented by a Hungarian scientist, and they changed the game completely. So, you know, so now I think that unless you use these kind of cables, you cannot even get a clean impulse response to a piece of equipment and back from it cleanly. So you cannot possibly get the best possible impulse response on which you will then base your plugin. So we have here a Focusrite channel, and honestly, Brainworx Plugin Alliance, they are fantastic in modeling these consoles. They sound absolutely amazing, and this is indeed one of the pieces that I use the most. This and of course the SSL and the Neve versions of it. They sound fantastic. I'm very lucky that I have used many of these consoles that they modeled. You know, the SSL, I did many mixes on SSL consoles, both G and E channel. This is an E channel, and I have to say that the Brainworx one is the closest one that I can tell, apart from maybe the UAD, to the actual real channel. And then of course we have the Neves, the APIs, which all sound fantastic. I use them a lot, and I base my whole mixing on those. But it's not the real deal. It's still not, it's still missing that little bit, and I still get that different, that extra 5% difference or improvement when we send it off to analog summing and then get it back, and then it just opens up and clears up beautifully. One more thing to mention here is of course that there's inherently an unfair comparison between different plugins, because of course no two different plugin manufacturers will have access to the same exact console. So maybe the consoles sound different that they model, and therefore of course the plugin also sounds different. So it's hard to tell if it's the plugin, if it's a better or worse plugin, or if it's the piece of equipment that they based the plugin on. And now to what I believe has the biggest impact on the way you mix, depending on whether you mix digitally or analog. When you mix analog, and this is the biggest difference, one, you don't look at the screen for that much. You hit play, the screen is usually on the side, the keyboard is probably on the side. You hit play, and then you don't look, you listen. When I mix here, I catch myself looking a lot more than I'm listening, and that has an effect on my work. And I noticed that that's of course a huge difference in how you work and what you do. You rely more on your ears and you do different things compared to when you work digitally because you are very, very distracted by the visuals. The second thing is that if you work on an analog console, you kind of know, you feel that, okay, on this console hits have been made. So you're not tempted to open more and more plugins and to overload your channel strip with 20 plugins because whatever reason, marketing, branding, or a false belief that it will make it better. You know that you can do a good sound, you can create a good sound with that one channel strip that you have in front of you, especially if it's SSL or Neve. So you will work your EQs and your compressors a bit harder and a bit more precise. You will revisit the settings instead of opening another plugin and try to fix a problem that maybe you created or that was there but you haven't fixed previously. So what I notice is that I work a lot more with my ears and I am more careful with the EQ settings on console and the compression settings, and I revisit them more often, and I don't use as many plugins. I sometimes never use plugins when I work analog. The second biggest difference is that if you are lucky enough, or when you're lucky enough to work on an analog console in a studio, then what that means is that you are in a studio, most likely with superior monitoring, superior acoustics, and amazing outboard gear, of course. But what that does is that it's apples and oranges. If you work from your bedroom or from your basement studio like I am, even though it's acoustically treated and I have very, very good monitoring, it is still not the same as sitting in a large studio in a big room with fantastic acoustics done by engineers with unlimited budget and acousticians, and of course huge main monitors, ATCs or something costing in the range of $50,000 to $100,000. I'm mixing here on something around $10,000 setup, so that's a significant difference in what it can deliver. So combine that ability to be able to hear more just because of the better monitoring and the better acoustics with the newfound kind of ability of listening better because you're less distracted by the visuals, and of course your mixing will change completely. I had this many times that I mixed something in a studio and I felt like I'm struggling because I heard everything. And then I was quite disappointed by the end of the session, but then I got home and I opened up the mix on my own setup and I was blown away. It was the best thing I've ever done. So the approach and the monitoring are the two main and most significant differences between analog and digital, I would say. But since we are normal mortals, we don't have millions for a studio, let's have a look at how we can still kind of create a decent analog-ish sound or mix in the box. And I'll just show you what I did on this mix. I'm not going to play this mix for you yet. I'll do a mix breakdown on it at a later point. But as you can see, I'm either using no plugins or I'm using analog emulations. In this particular mix, I wanted a Focusrite-ish kind of sound, SSL, and I mostly used the virtual mix rack and the Plugin Alliance stuff. So what I would do is, if I really wanted to have a purely analog kind of sound, I would probably just open one console across all of the channels, shift, select all of them up to here, and open up something like the Focusrite, the SSL, or a Neve, whichever sound you prefer. You can maybe mix and match. And then just work from that. And trust me, this is enough to create an absolutely amazing sounding mix. Now, just because we know that most people also record in more compromised fashion, because most people don't record in great studios anymore either, just like they don't mix in very good studios either, it is, I think, acceptable to have, on top of all of this, a good digital EQ. Put like a FabFilter Pro Q. I really love the Slate Infinity EQ, Or even the stock Logic EQ has become really good since version 9, I believe. So you can use any of these to notch out, to fix some problems, and then do the more broad sound shaping with the analog stuff. And then of course on the stereo out, you would use some bus, Neve, SSL, something like that. And then, I mean, this is a very comprehensive master bus setting that I have here, but if you wanted to keep it analog, then you would use some analog bus emulation with some EQ. You know, this is a kind of a Pultec emulation. And then I love the black box, it is also analog emulation. The fresh air, not exactly analog. Tape, of course. Tape is overrated, by the way, the digital emulation. So it's a bit of tone shaping, but it's not, it will not recover that harmonic extent that real tape is capable of. So this is how I would approach and how I am approaching mixing in the box to get a more analog sound. And of course, when it comes to vocals, I know there's bigger problems. Then I have a take no prisoners approach. You know, if the vocal is not recorded perfectly, I have some of that sometimes where it's just one EQ, one compressor, happy days. Sometimes you need a bit more, although here I have EQ, compression, 3 dynamic EQs to notch out resonances due to bad conversion and bad recording, and then a de-esser. So it's still kind of acceptable, but you know, it's not as pure as some would say. So this sums up my approach and my thoughts on the analog versus digital debate. Of course, I'm happy to have a chat with you about this anytime. If you are you know, nearby, let's have a beer, let's talk about it for hours or nights. I can talk about all of this for ages. If you like this video, like and subscribe, please follow me on Instagram and all of the social media. Hit me up on my website if you want to work with me. I do consulting, I do one-on-one masterclasses, and of course mixing and mastering, my bread and butter, my passion. So looking forward to hearing from you, and see you in the next video. Until then, happy mixing. Bye bye.